Welcome to After Deadline, the media podcast. We're your hosts, Kathy Fowler.
And I'm Mark Silverstein.
We are veteran TV news reporters who turn to the dark side, and now we work as PR and marketing gurus.
We love the media, and we are taking this podcast to the big leagues with today's guest. He's an award-winning journalist who's been covering the relationship between the media, the politicians, and the public at NPR since 2004. He's also the author of the book, Murdoch's World, The Last of the Old Media Empires. We are excited to welcome, I'm telling you, we have gone way uptown on this one, David Folkenflik from NPR. Kathy, look who we have. Look at him. Look at him. He's here. We went uptown. We went with NPR.
Yeah,
we have good. Tote bags aplenty.
We knew him when he was just a babe in the woods before he became famous.
I'd say you invited the best, and now you get the rest. So here I am.
Oh, it's David Folkenflik. Thank you. We're thrilled that you are joining us. We talk about the media. Kathy loves this podcast that we're doing because she thinks the media needs a PR person.
The whole industry.
The media itself. Just like somebody out there.
The entire media needs a PR person. And since you report on the media, what is the status of the media today?
Besides fake news, or is it still fake? I don't know. Where are we?
I think the status of, what would the status be? I think it would be, am I bleeding? It'd be like, geez, what's going on here? Look, we take it on the chin, sometimes justly, often for cause. And I think that, it's been not just a humiliating, but a humbling period for the press. But that period's really, almost a generation long now, where you have the new figures of cable news changing the ways in which TV was done. Your business was done, right? And then you have the web bring in these voices that don't have to be hired by, fancy editors in corner offices posting what they want. And suddenly then social media shows up and it can be zapped to everybody from anywhere instantaneously and shared, in even greater audiences than news organizations themselves sometimes have. And so we have to recognize we're not the only people in the room. We're not the only people who, even when we are the only people in the room, not the only people with expertise, we're not the only people with thoughts about this stuff, and that we have to earn everything all over again. All the trust that we took for granted and really did take for granted, all the subscribers and readers and listeners that we assumed would be captive, we had to earn through our coverage and through our efforts, and sometimes through hype, and I guess through PR as well. And sometimes the PR is baked into the thing itself. There are certain kinds of news outlets like BuzzFeed and in very different way, Fox News, that make its differentiation from the rest of the press kind of a calling card. And in the case of Fox, makes trashing the press a part of its calling card and lifting itself up while pushing others down. And, I guess in a way it's a little bit more like a century ago where you had, 7, 9, 13 newspapers in every decent sized city. And they were all brawling and trashing each other and, stealing each other's stories or trying to kill each other's stories. And that's kind of the scene that you see now. But there's also a lot of really important work being done. A lot of people doing this clearly for the love of it, because in a lot of newsrooms across the country, there's just not a lot of money to be made for it. And, people trying to hold powerful figures and institutions accountable, which is really the point of what we're up to. And that, to me, that little element there is not sexy. It's the part that I didn't used to say out loud, but it's, that along with, is part of this, the reason we're doing what we do. And also from my standpoint, I think from your guys' standpoint, when you were doing TV news and I first met you, it was to give people enough information to make informed choices, whether votes or thoughts and opinions, so that they could decide to be good citizens as well as just consumers of news, right? So they could decide what's best for their school district. So they're not scared. They're not just going off a rumor they heard at a bake sale or at a soccer game sideline or these days on Facebook, but they actually have something that they can pin down. And these days we really have to explain how we know what we know for people to trust us.
Do you think is that part, do we need to educate people? Because journalists all get lumped in, like you said, they're lumped in with cable news hosts who are not journalists. They're talking heads. They're lumped in with, anybody who has a blog anybody can be a journalist now. It used to be, you were kind of deemed a journalist when you got, you usually went to some type of school for it most of the time, not all the time, but then you were hired by, a newsroom. And so you were all of a sudden a reporter or a producer or an editor or whatever. And now just anybody can be. How will we ever get back to the point where, or do we need to educate the public? Like, guys, like Sean Hannity is not a news reporter. A news reporter is someone who, there are news reporters on Fox who are doing real news. Sean Hannity is not a reporter. I mean, how do we let them know so we're not just all lumped in as fake news and there's just no trust? I mean, I don't know how you get that back. Is it education or what is it?
Well, I mean, look, if we're doing our job right, all of what we do is a kind of education. There's been this big push towards what's called media literacy these days, so that in schools and universities and in institutions generally, people are given greater tools to kind of break down what they see. When I watch TV with my kids, I'll say to them, this is a commercial. And sometimes they're kind of funny. Sometimes they're interesting, but they're trying to sell you something or convince you of something. So just know that that's what this is going ahead. And it's okay to mute it or skip it because that's what they're doing. And if you want to watch it, that's great. But just because they say that's better butter than this other butter doesn't make it so. You have to figure out what you think for yourself. And that's constant critical thinking is constantly part of the conversation, even if it's not explicit with my kids. And, one would imagine with people who are reading, reported media criticism like I do, or listening to it on the radio, or seeing me talk in a forum like this. And it actually should be kind of packed into everything that we do. We shouldn't simply say, Sean Hannity, who appears on Fox News, we have to say what he is without necessarily denigrating him. There may be people who find value in him. But the funny thing about Sean Hannity is when it's useful to him, Sean Hannity will say, I'm not a journalist. When he's on the air talking about something, he says, we're investigating this, folks. We're going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to find information. He's not saying, I'm going to rouse you with highly ideological invective for your entertainment purposes and my profit. He says, we're going to investigate this because we care about the facts. But, when he gets sued, or when he gets called on appearing on a campaign platform for various, right-wing Republican candidates, and is sort of lightly chided by his network for doing so on the repeated occasions he's done this, he'll just say, I'm not a journalist. Everybody knows where I'm coming from. So, there's a disingenuousness for certain elements and actors in this realm built into it. And also, I just think it's very important to say the media is now so broad as to be almost a useless category.
Yeah.
Right. What's the breakdown between social media and media? What's the breakdown between mainstream media? That's the mainstream media. Well, Fox is the most profitable media enterprise in the country. I would say it is the mainstream media. When we're talking about news media, Disney makes more money, but the distinctions between entertainment and news are tough to parse. ESPN does great reporting. It also is one of the biggest partners for all these huge sporting leagues, which are essentially huge businesses, churn out money. And now that includes collegiate sports to just an astonishing degree. So, what I would prefer is a great degree of transparency. I'd prefer news organizations be clear about why they have opinion pages and what they hope to do there and label it more clearly. I'd encourage news organizations to label analyses more clearly and set them apart. The New York Times does this thing where if it's a news story, the right edge was straight. But if and the column was basically justified, which means all the text is uniform in terms of how it looks. If it's analysis, it's done this thing like this, where it's the word end in just at the ending of a word. So some lines may be longer than another. So it's a kind of a jagged edge. And for many decades, the idea was the readers were supposed to determine that between that and the word analysis in the smallest font possible, that this is slightly different nature of a story. I think readers of the Times kind of don't always understand the distinction, but are by and large smart enough to just sort of absorb what they want from it. But I don't think it's clear cut to the public what the distinctions are all the time. There is a movement in journalism, or there was for a while. I think it's sort of almost passé at this point to say, well, news organizations should be more open about their biases. Like The Guardian in London is a liberal newspaper. London has all these, the Times of London, owned by Rupert Murdoch, who, as controls and owns Fox News, is more right of center. The Sun newspaper was by and large a far right of center tabloid, also owned by the Murdochs. We should be that way here. And the New York Post is like that. I don't know that, I think there's more of a sensibility where the Times is more likely than the Times of London or the Australian, which is a similar paper in Australia, to take climate change very seriously, to look at issues of injustice, and to look hard at certain kinds of social issues. Does that make it a liberal paper? I think it is more in the center of the major metropolis where it is based than it is of the country at large. And so it depends on how you look at it. If you look at global centers across the world, it may be more centrist. If you think about it as an international paper that serves major cosmopolitan centers. But, you could, I think, argue that it has a liberal sensibility. I think it's just more of it's a choice rather than an ideology that's firmly fixed. What I think is that these places should own these things and say, these are the issues that are important to us, and here is why we think they're important. Rather than somehow coming out as partisan one way or the other.
Yeah, I find it funny, real quick. Just Mark, I'll let you get in your next question. But
no,
you don't find him funny
listening.
at all.
I'm just a bystander here. So
no, but
I get to hear David give a report. It's like listening to NPR. It's awesome.
You're saying it's about 22 minutes long. I get it.
Liberal itself is just being open-minded. If you look at the definition, shouldn't all reporters be liberal then? I mean, isn't that silly?
I think what I tell my kids when they go off to new adventures, right? Open minds, open ears, open hearts, curiosity, and then make your own assessments. But I think that, if the listener or the reader were equipped with the time and the tools to kind of ask these questions and to register what questions need to be asked that are beyond maybe what the person on the street would ask because they've got busy lives, I think that you're kind of being a very informed surrogate for them.
So you're the media correspondent. What's your title?
Unless my boss has told you otherwise today, unless I got
I got breaking news.
The guy. He's the guy.
That's the guy.
Media correspondent, media reporter, media whatever.
Critic.
But no, you're not a critic. Are you a critic?
This is such a fair question.
Criticize.
I do critique, right?
Critique.
I was asked, Kathy, at one point you worked at BL, right?
I worked at Jay-Z.
No, I know you worked at Jay-Z, but didn't you also do a stint over at BL? Or am I wrong?
No. I worked at
All right.
not at BL.
Well, so these guys, like your guys' former station chiefs, Drew Barry, right? They would ask me, what's the deal? What are you doing? And I'm like, this is a totally fair question. We try to label things clearly. But at the Sun, back when I knew you, I did straight news stories. I did analyses that we tried to label, and I did weekly columns that were kind of voiced, right? At NPR, the voice that you get is your actual voice. And then they let you run with that a bit, but it has to be rigorously reported. I genuinely do. I honest to God, you are not wrong. I do media criticism at times. I say, here's how this story fell short. Here's what was wrong with this, or here's how the standards weren't applied. I don't feel at this point in my career and life simply like in every instance that the most useful thing for the listener or reader is to say, here's some facts that happened today and leave it at that. But we try to be clear when I'm doing analyses. We have talked about this in the newsroom.
Does it all line up on the right? Or
the sound in your ear all lines up only in the right ear and not in the middle.
That's right.
Right?
It's good. Okay. That's how I know you're doing analysis.
So here's I talk about this with friends who used to be at the network a lot. And I feel that, if you're on a beat for a while, you are entitled to reach what are called earned conclusions. So this isn't pontificating or ideological. It's that you've done the reporting, you know it. You have a case to make, you land somewhere, like this is a failing or this would seem to be whatever, but you're making that conclusion on the basis of reporting that you're sharing with your audience so that they can come along with you on the journey, so that you're not simply saying, this is bad, and so say I, and now I'm going to denounce him for 4 minutes. It's like, no, here's what happened. Let's unpack what happened and why it's a problem. And we'll bring in other figures to do it. But I'm not simply always saying this professor over here says it's wrong and therefore it's wrong. I'm saying these are the canons of journalism and somebody's going to help me articulate them. And, having covered the beat for over 22 years, having been in journalism for over 3 decades, having covered sort of this intersection of media and politics pretty intensely now, I feel that I can bring value as that being part of what I do. But you're not wrong. And it's a fair question because it's a little blurred. And so we try to be clear. If I'm doing analysis, we'll have the host introduce me, say, Dave Folkenflik offers this analysis, or it might have that label on a piece if it's done online.
Sometimes I think the media, what I would say that they do wrong, but hey, you're the expert, is that I don't believe giving 50% of 2 arguments is always the best. Someone will go, oh, well, the media is giving more time to X side versus Y side. And I'm like, yeah, but if Y is lying and X is true, they shouldn't be giving 50-50. That's lazy journalism, in my point. That means that you don't know what the topic is. You should be giving the more time to truth as a reporter. And whether, so in a way, sometimes it looks unbalanced, but it's not balanced if you're literally there's not always.
I think that's what David's doing when he does analysis and
right,
he has
exactly.
the institutional knowledge. And
if it's not David, then if it's just reporters,
David's the only reporter I follow. So.
No, but David, would you say that reporters should do the 50-50? Do you think that that's wrong? Like when people go, well, you didn't hear as much time.
Let me turn that question on you for briefly, guys.
Okay.
In your old profession, local TV news or TV news generally, how much do you see that, in current coverage?
I see it and it upsets me. That's why I bring it up.
And how about you, Mark?
Well, when I used to cover food, I got both sides.
Hey, you did do real journalism.
At Food Network, I got the left.
You covered food and
right.
Beverage. Very different.
So yeah, no, do I see it? I don't even know. I barely watch. I watch what is it called when you watch what you want to hear? You're looking to reinforce what you believe, or you're looking to reinforce what you're interested in. Yeah, I just want to hear how bad this guy is or that administration is.
Oh my gosh, they're a terrible news consumer. Don't say that.
It's just the facts. Look,
it's just between us. Nobody has to know this.
Okay. I'm like, what?
It's not like you're podcasting this. So what I would say is, absolutely. That this is, I think a key element of our age. You've seen an evolution, I think, among a lot of more serious news organizations to the concept of fairness rather than the concept of balance. And, balance is a problem in 1,000 ways. Balance is, sounds great. It sounds objective. Balance sounds fair.
Mm-hmm.
But, balance isn't fair if balance isn't true.
Right.
So there are 2 problems with balance. One is that it creates an artificial equality. Mm-hmm. And the other is that it presupposes there are only 2 points on the spectrum.
Right.
I was having a conversation with a brilliant former colleague who was trying to work through certain kinds of abortion coverage in light of what's happened. And I said, there are probably about 7 to 13 places along the spectrum. Like, you're not going to achieve perfect balance and you shouldn't want to. You can be pro-choice or pro-life and have different gradations of what that means in terms of what you think public policy should be. You can have different gradations in terms of the degree to which you emphasize the health of the mother. There are just a ton of different ways to get into this. But one of the key things that you can't sidestep is that whatever you think about the Supreme Court ruling and the resulting steps taken in state legislatures around the country, this has created dramatic upheaval for people and institutions all around the country, even in states that the laws aren't going to change in. Mm-hmm. It's putting incredible pressures on it. And so there are questions to be asked, tough questions to be asked of people on all kinds of positions, both ideological positions on this issue, but also just institutional positions. Okay, you're the prosecutor in Harris County, Texas, which is Houston. one of the largest cities in the country, very liberal city in a state run by a lot of very conservative figures. What are you going to prosecute? You're at a hospital in a border town near a state that's going to ban most abortions. Are you prepared for the influx of people? Are you concerned about prosecution reaching across state lines? Are there ways in which social service systems are going to be overly taxed because they're not going to be taken care of there? Are pro-life people going to step up private and public health or help and safety nets for those families that are, or those single moms that are having kids at very young age? Like, what are the implications? So the idea of balance on that is not this is good, this is bad, and supplement that. It's reflecting life in all of its often painful complexity. And so there's fairness to the facts, there's fairness to the people you're reporting on, and there's fairness to your audience to make sure that they understand something. Those are the three fairness that I see there. And that's what I think is our shining star. And people talk about objectivity, meaning you take care of this side and you take care of this side, and that's being objective. Objectivity really a century ago was a process, and it was designed by social scientists to kind of try to replicate what was happening in the so-called hard sciences, where you could do as an experiment and do it again. And you were trying not to approach the experiment with your such fixed beliefs that you only saw things that, as Mark was talking about with TV jokingly earlier, you only saw things that reinforce what you already believed to be the case. And so the idea of objectivity as an approach, I think, is commendable. The idea of objectivity as an outcome, I think, is problematic if the facts get you to a certain place or are just messy and not easily, a binary system. And so that's kind of how I come at it.
All right, so let's get into you.
Hugely fascinating person.
Yes,
I understand.
I'm more interested in you than all this heavy thinking
spellbinding
stuff.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. This smartness stuff is, you went to Cornell. I can't even.
So sorry for that.
Yes, but so I mean, how do you decide what your story is going to be? Because I mean, we talked about there's so much out there. How do you decide this is the story du jour?
I mean, look, there's I think, 5-6 people at the Washington Post covering media. I think there's, when the media desk is full at the Times, there's, depending on how you count it, 8, 9, 10 people covering media when they're fully stocked. There's pretty much just me here. So it's a fire hose. And It means making choices. There are stories that I want to do in Tennessee and Chicago and Florida, and all over. And right now I'm kind of bogged down, doing pieces on some major lawsuits. There's a couple against Fox News. There's the media elements of the January 6th committee. I think these are very important things to do. I'm going to do a piece about a woman news entrepreneur who's fostering like a bunch of other people to do some great stories too, who I think is quite interesting and brilliant. There's a story developing and involving the LA Times that I'd love to get to, that I don't figure into the precise controversy, but I'm sort of did some reporting adjacent to it at one point. Like there's just a lot of stuff going on, and you try to pick your stories and knock them down. And sometimes it means you do an interview with somebody and the story appears months later and they're like, what did it take so long? And it's like, well, life is unexpected. There was a story that happened during the pandemic, I want to say in May of 2020. And I did a light little story and somebody said, you might really dig into this a bit. And I was like, it sounds bureaucratic and boring. It involved the Voice of America. Well, for those who don't know, Voice of America is been around since World War II. It's government owned. It's under this independent federal agency called the U.S. Agency for Global Media. And it broadcasts in, I think, 47 or 44 languages to over 200 million people a week in radio, TV, and on its website. And the idea is that it provides news to countries that can't get a free press, and provides news to those countries and about those countries. And there are sister channels that you may have heard of, like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I know guys know these things, but for your listeners and viewers,
I think it's singular listener. But go ahead.
Just like the Voice of America will be watching later.
Not with David.
VOA has Similar
So,
listenership.
like I poked around, and it turned out that Trump had appointed a guy whose nomination had languished for 2 years, who was a conservative journalist and documentary maker. And when he finally got through in late May, early June of 2020, he just started tearing the place apart. He was at the head of the oversight agency, and he just went nuts. And so ultimately, through months of coverage, I broke a lot of stories. Some other folks did too, Washington Post and other places. But we really spent a lot of time on this. And, we showed that basically laws had been broken. We showed things that were probably unconstitutional that judges pointed to. New legislation was drafted as a result of this, trying to insulate the journalistic independence from the political appointees who oversaw the agency that was above this news outlet. And look, there is inherently a tension when you have a news outlet that's funded by the government, but the BBC does a fine job of this by and large. And VOA is valued just as its sister. Right now, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is doing a lot of work in and around Ukraine that's been very important, and that, has driven Putin nuts. And, we should honor that kind of courage in journalism. And VOA similarly had done some great stuff. And these guys, it was an incredible example of two things. It was an example of Trump's contempt for the media and the independence of news organizations. He thought, or has decided to project, that he believes that the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR and other places are run by just political hacks. And therefore he feels no compunction making the Voice of America run that way. And the second thing is it was, I think, a perfect example of the way in which Trump corrupted or sought to corrupt the federal workforce and make it all subordinate to political imperatives, ideological imperatives, and personal whim. And so you had examples of one of their most distinguished journalists, their White House bureau chief, a guy named Steve Herman, was investigated for tweets where he had retweeted news stories by other professional outlets that had reflected negatively on Trump administration officials and the president. And they sought to, as part of the investigation, he had reported on the fact that then Vice President Mike Pence had violated the COVID protocols for, I think it was the Cleveland Clinic when he was visiting Cleveland, a major medical center. And, this was as blatant as anything I've seen. And so what could have been argued was a little bureaucratic, not a household name for Americans, because Voice America doesn't broadcast here, and in fact, by law, isn't allowed to. And, you could say there are a lot of other stories going on. We thought, what, we can show corruption in federal government. We can show political pressure illegally being brought to bear. We can show expenditure of tax money illegally. This is something we need to do. But, you have to kind of pick your battles. So, we've done stories over recent years about Bloomberg News or about the Washington Post, and also about much smaller news outlets. I did a story earlier this year. Spent several weeks on it, but it was about the relationship of the LAPD and the press and how it kind of fractured and ruptured during the BLM protests that broke out during, the height of the pandemic, and how it had, if anything, worsened in the months that followed. And, I'm proud of that. It's a specific police force. It's in one of the nation's largest cities, but it's also a stand-in for police city tensions, big city police department tensions with news journalists and news outlets at major cities around the country. And so it's an example, I think, of how we can provide insight on, a specific local story that has, national implications and insight there.
Is it hard to report on your fellow journalists?
There has been, look, as you guys know better than most, right? I've covered higher education. I've covered politics. I covered Congress and, Maryland's lawmakers at the national level and issues important Marylanders. And I've covered media. There is no one more thin-skinned, no one more controlling, no one more vituperative than news professionals about negative news coverage. Like, they lose all perspective on what a news story is and isn't, what you can accomplish, what they will feel coming out of it, the degree to which they're owed something, the degree to which something should be retroactively off the record.
Say what you're really feeling.
It is hilarious, including at times some of my own things. I've had to break stories about my own guys, and that's complicated. People, when you're breaking stories about the people who helped sign your paychecks, that is uncomfortable. And yet, we went through a Me Too thing at NPR. That was a big story that it was broken by the Washington Post, but and we had done some reporting trying to pin down an incident that had been brought to our attention and that I was able to confirm, but not in any way I could use on the record, as the woman involved said, I think it's been handled appropriately and I don't want this to be reported on in any way. And so, not every HR interaction is a national story, right? But once the Post broke a story about 2 decades old incidents, I was able to get that woman on the record. And then we decided, my editor and I decided, we're going to do this. We're not going to be beaten on anything. Like, no, we're going to learn. People at NPR are going to learn about it from NPR. And there were 2 reasons for that. One was pride. Probably a number of reasons. One was pride. One was I thought I had an obligation, and my team had an obligation to do this. It was an important story. I hold other news organizations accountable. I've got to hold my own. And the other thing is I wanted to show, as I've had to a number of occasions with strong support of my editors, that at NPR's lowest moments, it lives its values. And I think there are a lot of news organizations that don't. They shut it down. They shut up. Maybe they don't prevent others from reporting on it, but they do very little themselves. I've talked to reporters at dozens of news organizations subsequently about this. I had to do this when we fired Juan Williams back in 2010. And technically we severed the contract early of Juan, about 6 to 10 weeks early. He was about to be done and they were not going to renew it because it was a complicated relationship.
What was I forget the sticking point. He was a Fox News contributor and commentator, right. And he went on Fox and he said, it was a very interesting thing. He said, every time I see someone in Muslim garb on an airplane, I get anxious. Right.
And so, we understandably got complaints of people saying, this is racist towards Muslims. If you actually listen to what he was saying, he was rebuking Bill O'Reilly for saying something similar about blacks. And he was also saying, if you listen to it, it took about 45 seconds, but Williams said, I'm wrong to feel that way. That's not appropriate. That is my human response, and it's an inappropriate response. And he was trying to gently walk Bill O'Reilly to a better human place. But
it took
him a little while. This was the effort, the eternal dilemma, right? This is the dilemma of somebody like Juan being on Fox on those shows. And I've talked to Juan over the years, and he was very hurt by it. And he felt like he was saying something he wasn't ashamed of because he was trying to acknowledge his own failings as a person. But NPR had gone through a lot with Juan and was not super comfortable with the company he was keeping, to be honest, but also with his own commentaries on NPR itself, not for their content, but because the question of whether they felt he was sufficiently rigorous or providing original reporting or insight. And the relationship had fractured. There wasn't a lot of trust. My reporting on that in some ways caused real rupture, or not rupture, but friction between the top news editor who I adored and admired and still admire. I think is great. And myself, because it was hard for her to be in the middle of the cauldron of this story. I knew the second I heard about this would be a huge story. I think the news leadership was blindsided about how national it would be. But, Fox doesn't take something like that and report on it. Fox takes something like that and, before we had the phrase cancel culture, made it into a story about that and censorship. Roger Ailes called us a bunch of Nazis. By the way, our 2 top executives at that time were women and Jewish. So it was a particularly cruel and an offensive thing for him to say, for which he never apologized to them. But, that was one of those things where we had to cover it because I felt we needed to be on top of that story. In some ways, the Me Too story is a much graver story, but both of them were issues. And, I've done things that have been very, tough looks at the Times and the Post and Bloomberg and ABC News and all the rest.
Geraldo, is he still a fan?
Able to do that.
Is Geraldo still a fan?
It's a funny story. You guys remember
Rivera,
that.
Fox News. Okay, go ahead.
So I did a story 20 some years ago now about how he did reports talking about how he wept and prayed over the spot on which American soldiers and Afghan allies were bombed by American bombers by mistake, but was able to show for the Sun that he was about 300 miles away. So he went on a tear at the time, and he went on the Tonight Show and accused me of penis envy, which I thought was pretty hilarious. And he told the Boston Globe he wanted to, punch me in the nose and find me, to which I mentioned to the guy to the Globe, do you think he really wants to do that? I mean, I work at the Baltimore Sun. It's not exactly the National Security Agency. You can find it on a map. It's just all this bluster. And he tried to get me fired from the Sun, which didn't happen. But so every now and then he pops off about it. He wrote about it in his book, in his memoir. It's like 2 chapters of his memoir.
Right. You definitely took up space in his. It took up space.
You still are probably taking up space in his head.
Yeah.
Well, so his agent invited me to the party for the book.
Uh-oh.
So
for his book.
So
Yeah.
Were you like, do I need to bring security there? Am I gonna?
No, so I went after work. It's only, Fox is only 4 blocks from NPR's New York bureau. So I went after work. I went to the bar where they held it, and I walked down a side corridor, and there was this, 30-person line or more to get book signed, and everybody wanted to talk to Geraldo. And when he took a break from being interviewed by some like 15-year-old podcaster, I just stepped in and introduced myself because we'd never met in person, and said, I'm not here to, basically I wanted to let him know I'm not here to spoil your party. Best of luck with the book, and, best wishes for all that's ahead for you. And he said, oh, and he was he had a big smile, and he was, I think, taken aback, but I don't know if he was touched, but amused. And he said, have you read the book? And I said, I've read the chapters. And he said, well, what do you think? I said, I think it's fun. I said, but if you want to come out for a cup of coffee sometime, I'll talk about it for you as long as you want. And I said,
wow.
And so he has not taken me up on that, but the offer stands that he's just wrong. But the question is, in some ways, what he believes, or whether it was useful to believe it or whatever. But it was pretty interesting because the raw tapes are basically him turning to his brother, Craig, and the other cameraman and said, are you on me? Are you on me? And then they're on him. And then he goes to one knee and he says, the Lord is my shepherd, hallowed be thy name. So, if you're overcome by prayer, it's quite a way to set it up.
Maybe it was the high holidays or something. He wanted proof that he was praying.
That's right.
Oh my gosh, that's funny.
So what was that like? I mean, it was pretty hot. It was a pretty big story for a while, and he kept fanning the flames. And here you are, at the time, you're at the Baltimore Sun, so you don't have all the experience that you have now. I mean, you were quite. I'm going to talk about how I first got to know you at the Sun, but I mean, that must have been a lot of heat and pretty uncomfortable.
It was fascinating. I mean, it was fascinating. I think, I did a story and it was fine. And then one of the top PR people at Fox called up and taunted me and said, and I kept the voicemail for years, but it was something along the lines of, you got picked up by Reuters and, CBS Market Watch, pretty pathetic placement, my friend. So I was like, okay. So I then went and interviewed, like a bunch of network executives and said, okay, so a story has been shown to be untrue. And Fox has not acknowledged this in any way. Like their chief war correspondent in Afghanistan did a story praying, he claimed, over the bot that, blown up dismembered parts and uniforms of troops. And it's just not true. And he didn't do it just once. He did it twice. He did it once and he did 12 hours later. So they stood by this story. I was like, would not most news organizations find some way to correct the record? That was just my question. What would you do? I innocently inquired of, I think, a former CBS official. I think I talked to NPR's ombudsman, or Jeff Dworkin at the time, and I talked to some other, and I just did a little story on it. And Drudge picked that up. And then it became a huge story. Then it became a huge story, right? So that was fascinating. And what was really interesting, I remember Howie Kurtz, now interestingly with Fox, went on CNN, and he was on with Aaron Brown, who I think had one of their evening news shows at the time. And Kurtz was sitting maybe 6 feet away from me. And he said, he's like, I have a lot of problems with the Geraldo Rivera's reporting, but I'd cut him some slack on this one. It's confusing to be out there.
The older statesman is telling you how to do it, right? Yeah, okay.
Basically,
confusing to be out there. I mean, you don't need to get your
listen,
facts
kid.
right.
Here's what you should do.
Look, maybe he hadn't looked at the story that closely. I mean, like, we really did reporting on this, and I talked to all kinds of folks who were in and around the area to confirm exactly what could have happened. And one of the things we concluded was that the things that Geraldo pointed to as saying, well, I was confused by these other friendly fire incidents that killed civilians. Those aren't technically friendly fire incidents, but they are terrible, and they're whatever. But they hadn't happened yet. Like, so I had a line in my second story saying, Rivera could not explain why he was confused by an event that had not yet occurred. And he took exception to that, but the facts supported it. In any event, Kurtz says that, and then Jonah Goldberg, who's a conservative pundit for CNN at that time, weighed in and said, "I don't know why you would do that." He said, he said to Kurtz, he said, "This is a serious thing. Either you have it right or you don't, and if you don't have it right, you keep faith." And then Kurtz did a story. He called me like I was mailing, I think, holiday gifts to my parents. It was late December of 2001, and or cards or something. And he called me and said, "My editors make me do a story on this, so I want to interview about it." I said, "Okay." But, it was then elevated, and then it became a thing where it was on The Daily Show. Stewart did something on it. It was on The Tonight Show. It was a thing. And so it became a thing. I just never experienced anything like that. And so, for a guy to go on Leno and, say that you've got penis envy or something, it's like, it's something about Rivera that I would pay money not to think about.
Yeah, please, I think you really do without the imagery.
It's like, that's okay. But, it was an introduction. I think it did good things for me. People remembered the kid with the funny name who did the story, right? But it also taught me you never back down from a bully. You are careful with the facts. I've gotten things wrong. I've made corrections over my life. I'm mortal, and I think we are all mortal. But given that we are grounded in the fact, it teaches you never give up an inch. As senior editor at the paper who had known Rivera from a previous life, was besieged by Rivera to try to fire me or whatever. And he sent a note to Rivera saying, "Look, we've reported this, we've reviewed this, we showed the raw footage that David obtained to the Air Force officials who were responsible for some of the bombing raids, and they confirmed that what you wrote was accurate and that there were no bodies there, and that this wasn't an area that was bombed. We've done our reporting and it's sound." However, this editor wrote, "I believe on a personal level, I personally believe knowing you that you didn't intend to mislead anyone." And I said to this editor, "This is wrong." He showed it to me. He was very proud. He's like, "Look, I will have settled this between gentlemen. We'll have resolved this issue." I said, You're creating daylight between me and you, because I'm not reporting that he was deceitful, because I don't know. I don't know what he believed or didn't believe. But I'm also not reporting that he wasn't. I'm going where the facts take me on this. And I'm being very careful, stop short of saying that he was, what his motivations were or what his state of mind was.
You
But
didn't
he
call him
will
a
use
liar.
this.
You just said that's inaccurate. And when you're inaccurate, you need to correct the facts. And that's how we get trust from our readers or listeners, or that's important to admit that you're wrong, admit when you're wrong. I like it when, no matter who it is, but our industry, if you have trust and you have to admit when you make mistakes, it's painful. But I always tell people, a journalist is only as good as their last story. And sometimes you make one big mistake and you could be known for that. Look at Dan Rather. And you can make one big mistake and that could shadow your whole career. Brian Williams, he made a comeback. Dan Rather's made a comeback. But those big mistakes, whether it's yours or you're just the face of it, can be detrimental.
No, I think that's right. I don't always think it's fair if somebody falls short on a story and that's that's the only thing people think they're as good as. But I also think it really depends how you deal with the story.
Yeah.
Rather has the weight of a lot of, strong coverage over the years. He's a flavor that a lot of people love, a flavor a lot of people love to hate. That's fine too. Like Geraldo, he personalized the news, right? He made it, he was a character in a lot of his stories. But
Gunga Dan, to go
yeah,
back.
Gunga Dan in Afghanistan actually is where that was. But the real problem with what Rather did was that they made a terrible mistake that was born of some arrogance, particularly on his sister's part, but shared by, Rather was a full partner in that. Don't, outsource that. But the way Rather dealt with the questions being raised, initially he used his own airwaves to shoot them down. And that was a problem because it put the integrity of all of CBS News on the line. And then when it blew up, CBS has to find a way to restore it. And that had repercussions for years at the network and was, a terrible way for Rather to go out.
Here's my Folkenflik story. So we're working in Baltimore and we are two thin-skinned reporters, you and I, Kathy.
Sure.
And there was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun. I will not name him, but he covered the media. And he always had this way of looking down his nose at local media if and when he decided to write about local media. And then this young kid comes to town, David Folkenflik, and starts writing about the media scene there. And I'm like, this guy gets it. This guy knows his stuff. So I called him up and told him that, told him he knew, and started leaking stories to him. And what I'm here to say now is I'm tired of carrying your career here, buddy.
It's all on you. And just so you know, that's what I always told the GMs at the stations in town. I'm like, listen, this is what Mark said. I don't know what
Silverstein said it.
Mark told me off the record. I'm sure it's totally true.
It's basically right often. Is what I said because Mark told me. So
it's subjective.
I mean, what more do I supposed to do?
Well, David, I think he was doing that so just to make sure you didn't start reporting on him. He was
I
trying
didn't
to
care if he reported
friends.
on me. I'm fine. Like, just spell the name right. I don't give a shit what he says about me.
No, Mark was I think magnanimously indifferent to anything, and just hilarious, and that was a lot of fun. I mean, that was fun stuff. There's this one. I was writing a lot about local TV when I first joined, and I have fondness for my former colleague as well as my former colleagues there. So I want to stick up for him. He's a very smart guy.
You wrote about a young reporter getting fired from Channel 13, if I remember correctly. Being me.
I remember that.
Yeah,
I remember that. That was a story. I remember your former boss getting pretty ticked off at me, the GM at 13, and saying, why the hell are you always focusing on us? How, this is just intrusive. It interferes with our ability to cover the news. And he said, how would you like it if we started covering you? And I said, that would be great. He said, what do you mean? I said, we could use it. We're the biggest news organization in the state of Maryland. We should get scrutiny, and good scrutiny. I was like, and you should assign one of your reporters full-time to do that. Which of your 28 full-time reporters would you like to assign to do that?
And
then there was this long pause. And I said, and how much of your 55% profit margin are you willing to devote to covering the Baltimore Sun? Because it will not be a huge advertiser generator for you. And he said, okay, very clever, David. Very clever. And I was like, well, That's the point. Like, we're paying somebody to do this because we think it matters. And it was interesting with Bill Fine, who was over at BAL, would get irked at times. And we talk, but we all, I always wanted open lines of communication, would always take calls, would always make calls, right? But Bill Fine, after a while, like I did a story, it was called The Artifice of News, and it showed how they had a reporter in DC who had a duffel bag. And so she would do her reports about, changes in mortgage rates and Fannie Mae or whatever. And she would say, and I can't remember her name, but let's say it was Carol Lee, WBAL Channel 11. And then she'd take off the thing and she'd say, I'm Carol Lee, WCVB 5 Boston. Take it off, because she was working for Hearst and she was doing it all, and they would rebrand her that way. And so she would do the same report and then put it in there. And so I talked about the artifice of news and how it made it seem as though BAL had its own dedicated reporter in Washington reporting only for them. And that wasn't the case. And was this a scandal? It wasn't a scandal, but it's a little sleight of hand. And he just called me and he's like, I could be ticked at you, and you didn't go through PR to talk to the reporter involved. He's like, but I see what you're doing. I was like, what I do? He's like, you're learning. He's like, you're breaking down the business into its constituent parts and figuring out how it works, and then telling stories based on that so that you understand the business. And then you're going to go forward and report on the business. And I was like, yeah, that is kind of what I'm doing. I mean, like, it's new to me. I didn't know. I was like, so I figured it'd be interesting to your viewers. He's like, I get it. He's like, it's fine. Do what you got to do. Totally fine. Like, it was a very grown up, like, epiphany. I feel like
that
he
was
had.
Bill
And it's
Fine
true.
at 11.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a good guy.
Yeah. He's retired now, but he's a it was just an interesting moment where he was willing to step out of sort of his corporate interest for the moment and say, I understand what's happening and I can be at peace with that.
So,
all right. So you wrote a book 10 years ago.
Murdoch's World, the last of the old media empires. How was it writing that book? What was that? And do you think you'll write another book? And what He's
I don't know.
Like, no.
It could happen. I mean, I wrote it at the time because it was a great topic. Murdoch owns the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, a bunch of stations around the country, and also, of course, Fox News. And he, through having similar holdings in Australia, which is where he was born, and the UK, he really has influenced politics and political culture in all three of these major English-speaking countries to an unrivaled degree. There's no one who's done more in those three countries. And in the US, you see the shape of politics right now is very much because of Fox News over the last 26 years. Not only, but very much, Roger Ailes, who he hired after sort of initially launching it to really come in and have the vision or articulate the vision that he wanted. And they were really not identical, but birds of a feather in what they wanted. Ailes would always describe as the most powerful name in news. Power is not something to which journalists should aspire. And it's not something that most journalists do aspire to. Maybe they want to be famous. Maybe they want to be wealthy. Maybe they want to be influential and listened to. Maybe they want to get a great table at fancy restaurants or the best tickets at Broadway or at the ballpark. But, those are not necessarily virtues, but maybe that's, on your secret things, there might be people who say that or want to be recognized around town, want their name on a bus, Jane Miller.
Some of the advantages, but that shouldn't,
that shouldn't be why you do it.
Right.
It should not be driving you. And power should have nothing to do with it, because that's not what journalists are supposed to check power.
Yeah.
Right? They're supposed to, but they are sources of power in some ways. New York Times is very influential to the point where it can, help bring down a governor. There's a power in that, but that you're not exercising it because you can. You're exercising it because you're trying to hold people accountable.
For the good of, you're the fourth estate, you're the protector. Right. Yeah, for the public.
For the public. So, for me, it was a great topic. It was a great challenge. I'd done newspaper reporting, I'd done radio reporting. I'd never written a book. The challenge of doing that was intellectually, if I'm going to stay on the same beat for, at that time, over a decade, now over 2 decades, I wanted to do new things to challenge myself. And the third thing was had been this incredible uproar in Britain where their tabloids had hacked routinely into as it turns out, the phones, the cell phones, the voice messages, the emails, the private lives of people. And, for years, Brits have sort of accepted that as the price of celebrityhood and royalty and stardom, whether in soccer or Hollywood or whatever. And if you think about London, it's really a combination of New York, Washington, and Hollywood for Britain. Like, it's all there. And so everybody's in a relatively contained space where the media can just go after them relentlessly and do. And the public was fine with that. Like, if you're a royal, fine, you're fair game, you're living off our money, like whatever. If you're celebrity, fine, you're rich and fancy. But it turned out they were doing this to war dead. It turned out they were doing this to murder victims. It turned out they were doing this to people who were just run-of-the-mill folks. And then the British public, it was an outroar when it was turned out that a 13-year-old missing girl who turned out to be killed had her phones hacked into by the newspapers and her voicemails listened to. And it was a step wildly too far. And as a result of the inquiries that ensued, I had this insight and documentary insight into how Murdoch and power and influence work behind the scenes, how so much of, you were able to see the way in which people inveigled their way inside corridors of power in London, the government, regulators, made the cabinet, ways in which they were able to kind of lobby in ways that were probably illegal through text messages and drinks after dinner and things like this. You were able to see how the tabloids routinely just paid people off to shut them up and keep them out of view so that the public wouldn't know what they did to get the news. And so it seemed an opportunity to explore the nature of the Murdoch DNA and what lessons we could apply to what was happening in the US. Now, my book was published, if I remember correctly, in the fall of 2013. So this was before the Roger Ailes sexual harassment scandals. It was before Murdoch took over and went all in on Trump, even though he has contempt for Trump as a person. It was before, think about these 3 signal conspiracy theories that have been put out there to, I think, greatly debilitating effect of the body politic. The death of Seth Rich, claiming that this young man who was murdered on the streets of Washington early morning hours of July 2016, who was working for the Democratic Party, was actually the person who leaked tens of thousands of emails to WikiLeaks because he was secretly a Bernie Sanders fan. when it was the Russians, as basically the entire US intelligence community concluded under Obama and Trump. But that way, saying the Russians really weren't interfering with Hillary Clinton and the Democrats in the 2016 elections, when they clearly were, whether or not that through the election one way or the other, they clearly interfered with those elections. Fox was integral to propagating that bullshit. The election lies of 2020, what happened in November, Fox was the first to call Arizona for Joe Biden. And if Fox sought to make it up to Trump, and more importantly to Trump fans, who are their most avid viewers, ever since. And that meant that they were the home for a variety of lies, including claims that the Smartmatic voter technology company and the Dominion voting machine company were somehow in league to transfer and divert votes for Trump to Biden. Bullshit in everything that has been determined on that. Fox is currently being sued to the tune of more than $4 billion. And whether or not those cases have merit legally in terms of defamation is something for the courts to determine. But those cases are going forward. And so, in the Seth Rich's family's lawsuit against Fox, they settled the day before Sean Hannity, Lou Dobbs had to testify. In this case, it's pretty clear that the litigants won't settle until they're a lot farther along in the deposition process, because they want to discover as much as they can about how things really, what things look like when you look under the hood. And so Fox was integral to, and again, not the only actor on that, but integral to that. Fox argues, I think understandably, that they were covering what powerful and influential figures like the president at that time, Donald Trump, his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, his crackpot other lawyer, Sidney Powell, that we're saying, and that it's okay to cover that. But, there are arguments to be made that these were very warmly received crackpot theories by influential or people holding influential positions. And then there's the third thing, which is on January 6th, which of course stemmed from this misbegotten belief that the elections were stolen. This violent siege of Congress to stop the certification, to harm Pelosi and Pence, that these were patriots who did, essentially people doing minor vandalism, not an insurrection, not an attempt to essentially block the workings of democracy, not
a dust up. It was a dust up, according to
that's right.
The guy
it was a minor Donnybrook, let's be honest, an imbroglio at most. So this thing has been propagated by, among others, Tucker Carlson, perhaps their most popular individual star. And these are three signal moments that I think encapsulate the Trump years and Fox's footprint on the Trump years. And, all of that wasn't in the books. So like, if I were to write it now, also there'd been, another marriage and another divorce since then.
I'd buy the book, the new book, the updated book,
but also
the second book.
But it just tells you how much changes.
In your next book that we've determined you're going to write, you also have to write about, literally democracy is potentially on the line. Like, people think when reporters say that and whatever, that's like hyperbolic. And I would have, when I hear it coming out of my mouth, it sounds like that, but it's just like, January 6th was scary, and journalists and thank God the courts, there's been a couple things that have really stood and on the front lines to protect, us from, what's happened in other countries. But I wonder how strong the fourth estate is. And I do worry that, much like police are outgunned by kids with AR-15s, that the journalists and the media is outgunned by all this other stuff that can
you answer that question in 10 seconds or less? So we're going to let you go.
Yeah. Anyway, I just do you think that journalism in the future, when you just look to the future, is it going to be enough?
I don't think journalism is enough on its own. I think that every generation and cohort, like many generation, has to be resolute and engaged and involved. That civic participation sounds like a do-gooder thing that teachers yap at you in high school, but it's necessary for the functioning of democracy. And nothing is foreordained. Like, you have to earn this stuff, and it can slide away. And you've seen it in Hungary, and you've seen it in other countries where people slowly extinguish independent checks on power Journalism is a huge part of that, but not the only one. I don't think journalism has done perfectly in the Trump years. It overstepped at some times. It was too timid at others. But you've seen folks like, take a guy like Jonathan Karl at ABC News, always very measured, always wanted to be seen as balanced, always very careful. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he emerged early in his career from conservative media. And yet I think it didn't radicalize him and make him like an editor of The Nation magazine or something, but it radicalized him in the sense of him calling things out in a different way and saying, this is a threat. Things that there are moments here that are not, we can't be neutral on. If we talk, you can't, to be a journalist and be fair is not to be neutral on the continued sustaining of democracy. Like, to be journalism is to do journalism right, and to hold people accountable of all stripes is to engage in the sustenance of democracy itself. And it sounds really highfalutin to say it, but it's absolutely part of what's going on. It's why the erosion of the financial status of local news is so troubling. But right now on the national level, those are the stakes. It's not about party, it's about the understanding of our society. And I think there are so many journalists trying so hard to get it right that I'm that is one of the areas of hope. But no, journalism on itself doesn't get it done. You need all institutions saying, whatever our beliefs about policies, whatever our disagreements, and there are many and myriad, we have to be committed to the idea that there is a rule of law and that people have an equal say in how they're going to be governed.
I think there's nothing more patriotic than some great reporting. When I read it, you're out there on that front line there, dude. So stay strong and keep doing what you're doing.
Listen, when I think about fulfilling my civic duty, it is a column I wrote about you when you joined the Food Network.
I think that was your bright shining
that was
moment.
My peak.
Yeah, that was the peak. It's been a little downhill, but that's okay. You'll make it come back. I mean, this podcast, that's what we're trying right now. We're trying to lift you up, David.
I'm only as good as my last podcast. It's what I tell myself. Hey guys, it's such a treat to see you both. Like, what a glorious thing.
Man, we follow you. We follow you on Facebook, and we stalk you and your fam. but keep it going. Yeah, you're just really inspiring. What you keep doing.
Thank you. Be in touch. Give me hell.
All right, we will. Thank you. Thanks,
right,
buddy.
Thanks.
Oh my God, that was so great to hear and talk with him, and never back down from a bully, but correct your mistakes. I think those are two takeaways from many of talking with David Folkenflik of NPR.
I learned a lot today. I wasn't paying the Voice of America and stuff. I just follow David Folkenflik and listen to him. He's really just an incredible resource and an honest, a great journalist.
And he used a lot of big words. He's a smart reporter. I have to look up some of the words he used.
He went to Cornell. What are you going to do? We'll forgive him. After Deadline, the media podcast is a production of On the Marc Media. If you want to hear more, if you liked what you heard and you want to hear more from us and the incredible journalists across the country, be sure to follow us on social media at on-the-marc-media, Mark with a C, and subscribe to After Deadline, the media podcast, anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. Until next time, we'll catch up with you after Deadline.